And this is really central to how the human brain works in terms of we are huge pattern seeking creatures. Everything is about trying to understand what those patterns are, because this is what then is going to enable our success in whatever type of environment we find ourselves in. I'm your host, Jim Jones, and I want to welcome everybody to Kinship Cafe. And today we're going to pick up our study again on chapter 6. And let me go ahead and start sharing my screen here. So I'm going to do one thing a little bit different this time, and I want to start talking about the background before we get to the actual text. So we're going to kind of turn things around here a little bit. And where I want to start is this very unique aspect of the Daodejing that seems to be reasserting more of a Paleolithic perspective that seems to be resurfacing in China during this Warring States period. And so to kind of just get a handle on this again, I want us to go back and think about, you could even think maybe about movies where people get stranded out in the wilderness, like a Tarzan movie, origin type story, or I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember something like Robinson's Crusoe or any of these types of things, where somebody suddenly finds themselves out in the middle of nowhere and they have to figure out how to live, right? And it's all comes down to this idea of understanding patterns and looking for teachers, whether those teachers are animal teachers or whether they're other people. There's things that they need to learn and understand in order to survive. And this is really central to how the human brain works in terms of we are huge pattern seeking creatures. Everything is about trying to understand what those patterns are, because this is what then is going to enable our success in whatever type of environment we find ourselves in. So when we're thinking about the Paleolithic context, then they're certainly much more, let's say not more, but we tend to find ourselves very sheltered in a sense from reality, because, and that's not even the right word either, much more sheltered from just being out in nature, right? That we're not as comfortable with, how would we survive if we got stranded in the woods or something like that. Whereas before, that was much more a part of the normal human experience, was that we just simply existed out in nature, especially during the hunter-gatherer period, where, that's what we did. We didn't really have homes or structures that we created so much as we were just out there traveling around. And so it's very important to understand how things work. And there must have been a tremendous amount of just awe and amazement at the idea that nature itself was so generative in the sense of creating new life, whether it was new plants or new animals or things that were super necessary for how humans lived, the fact that there was water and air and all these things, and it was just provided. There's much more of an idea that life was being received as kind of like this gift, and that the parallel, if you will, with how that happens with the females of our species would have seen a much greater correlation between the two. And certainly what we find from the time frame that we started creating artifacts is that that was being celebrated. There's these ancient figurines going back as early as 40,000 years ago that we have dubbed Venus figurines, that are basically these carvings that celebrate women, but especially from the perspective or accentuating the aspects that have to do with reproduction. And so this is part of what we want to keep in mind, is that at this stage of thinking, there's this connection about how life is able to produce and give what we need, and that we have the ability to kind of participate in that process, specifically on the female side, and how this starts to shift. So when we move into more of the Neolithic period, and certainly up into the time frame where we're experiencing, or when the Daodejing is being composed, there's a massive transition that has happened where we are now in more of a modern sense, kind of with these structures and things that kind of protect us from the wilderness. The wilderness is seen as something that's bad or evil. Usually, it's how it's kind of depicted, that there's this kind of belief that we need society and culture in order to protect us from the wilds, and that within that we have much more of a focus on scarcity, that we have to figure out how to preserve and collect because there might not be enough. And it tends to be much more hierarchically organized. And because of this idea of scarcity and this idea of, property that needs to be defended, more of the male attributes tend to be accentuated in this context. And whereas before we may have had more of our personifications of natural forces as female, we see those transitioning now into more male manifestations. Even if we want to think about these in terms of like deities, that creates a very different distinction in terms of how life is being experienced. And it also has a lot more to do with this idea of control. So within the Chinese classical Taoist thinking, there's these balances, this yin and yang. And definitely the yang side of it is about the maleness, about the control, about the order. And the yin is more about the femaleness and about the novelty or the chaos, in the sense of things being new and not necessarily predicted. Definitely this idea of this generative side of things, and they need to kind of be in balance. And part of what's being suggested is that the yang has become over dominant, and so there's this movement to reassert the feminine aspect in this Taoist perspective. And so that's part of what we're going to see in this particular chapter that we're going to be looking at. But I want to kind of follow through on a little bit more of this kind of perspective they would have had then, in terms of how they saw the, in a sense, we might say, the natural world. So our chapter today is going to talk about valleys. And so when we think about how valleys are perceived within this natural context, this is going to be an area where we see an abundance of life happening. So if you think about way up on the mountaintops, especially the really tall mountains, you don't even have things that are growing because it's above maybe the tree line, right? But then you come down into the valley, and here you have places where water collects. You've got things like seeds that are collecting there just because of things rolling down the hills or being brought in by birds. It attracts animals. So you've got the water, you've got the plants, you've got the animal life. So the valley becomes kind of like this symbol or this location that you can think of that's very rich in terms of life. And so there's a couple of aspects of this then that kind of come into play that are noticed within the Taoist thought. One is that it's low. So there's a frequent contrast between things that are high or above and things that are low or below. And whereas, let's say in the more dominant culture, this idea of being elevated, of being raised up, is kind of valued from more of that yang perspective, that masculine perspective. The flip side is seen as more of a female perspective. And this, keep in mind, might not sound exactly politically correct in our modern day context, but we're just talking a little bit more historically here, how they kind of conceived of these two roles. But they would have seen the female then as something that is occupying the lower space, whereas maybe that's not valued in the culture. They're saying, actually, this is where all the magic happens. This is where all the real power is. That, the Tao seeks out the low places. It's like water. It travels in the places that other people maybe don't want to go, but in doing so, that's actually where, life happens. That's where, the nourishment happens and all of the good things. The other thing is that the valley passively receives these things. The way that the rain falls, the things are collected to it, the way that it actually receives all the things that it does is it just happens. It just comes to it. So we can think again about a lot of the Taoist thinking that there's a lot that we get in trouble with when we try to control things. Whereas when we look in nature, they might make the observation that there's not anybody in control of the forest. But yet, the plants know what they need to do. The animals know what they need to do. The seasons do what they need to do. And it all just happens, and it's all balanced, and it all just keeps going, even though nobody's really in control. And so the valley then becomes a symbol of this as well, in terms of it passively receiving. And then it's actually producing, right? So this low passive concept, which seems to be counterintuitive and exactly the opposite of what's being valued in the larger society, is what then is creating a context and where this production and this life is actually happening. And so then they would see this again as the female kind of modeling this idea in nature. And in fact, whenever the Tao is personified, it's personified in a feminine context. So maybe I'll just kind of pause for a second.
You're telling us that Lao Tzu was an early feminist then?
In a sense, you could say that. Yeah, there's definitely this idea that I wouldn't say feminist in the sense there's a couple of different ways in which feminism can be talked about. So I guess we need to kind of clarify some things. So sometimes feminism is presented where, women are doing the same things as men do, right? You can see sometimes in action adventure movies where you start to have more female leads in these roles. They're just as violent. They're just as tough. They're doing all the stuff that men are doing, and it's trying to create kind of like this equality between men and women. And that's not the direction I think that you would find in classical Taoism. It's much more trying to maybe celebrate the uniqueness of the different attributes, whereas masculine and feminine is something that exists in all people, whether you're male or female. There's a balance between those. So even in the male, you would have a balance of yin yang. Same thing with the female. But in terms of this cultural balance, it's trying to accentuate the things that would be seen as more kind of uniquely female, rather than trying to elevate women as being the same as males. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So again, this is a completely different context and time frame than a modern day context. And so we might have other ways we prefer to talk about these things today. This is just trying to get a sense of, from a cultural perspective, how they were looking at some of these aspects. So again, the Tao and the Daodejing, when it is personified, tends to be personified in female sense. So we might recall in chapter 1, it talks about it being the mother of the 10,000 things. So we definitely have this female aspect. Here in chapter 6 that we're going to be looking at, it's kind of personified as the valley. So here we're going to also see a female aspect of this that is brought into play. And then the goal for the sage or the wise person is then, how do we move into a position of having harmony with the Tao? How do we, come alongside with that so that we're not trying to work against it? Saw an interesting story, another kind of Taoist story presented the other day that had to do with this guy that built this house by the river, and the river kept flooding and ruining his house. And so he kept trying to control what was happening with the river by building dams. And the more he built up these dams trying to control the flow of the river, then eventually it would break through this dam and the destruction to the house would be even more severe. And so you have kind of this ironic effect that the more you try to control something, the more potential damage that you're going to be creating through trying to control that. And so that the goal, rather than how do we control and force this nature thing to happen, the goal is more, how do we understand, again, that idea of those patterns? Oh, we can see that, this river, overflows its banks periodically, and there's certain things that kind of go along with that in terms of these maybe seasonal things. So maybe we need to build the house in a different place so that it's not going to be affected by the floodwaters, because we see that pattern happening. And this would be the idea then of moving into harmony with those patterns, or moving into harmony with the Tao, which again is this idea of these natural ways that things happen. And in doing so, then you're much more successful in terms of preserving your house and, existing with nature instead of trying to fight against it and finding that you keep hitting your head against the wall. So that would be the strategy that's proposed and expected within this context. And then we'll also see in this chapter that the idea of darkness is going to come back. So we saw this as well in chapter 1, where it concludes by saying, there's this darkness within darkness, and that this is the gateway to all understanding. And again, when we think about that yin-yang balance in classical Chinese philosophy, the yang, the masculine, the control side, is white in the image, and the yin, the female, the creative, the newness side, is black or dark. And so this reassertion of the darkness is about that reassertion of the yin, about reasserting that kind of female aspects of understanding nature and how do we work in harmony with it. And that becomes then this gateway through which we start to be able to perceive and work with and balance our lives within this context. So all these elements are going to come to play in this new chapter that we're going to look at. But I'll pause for a moment and just see if there's any questions about this before we get into the text. No? All right. Then here we go. There we go. So it says, the valley spirit never dies. It is called the mysterious. And here, this English translation is translating the same word that is normally translated as dark. And I think, again, the reason this happens is that dark in a Western context is usually associated with negative things, with something bad or foreboding or evil. And so they're trying to get at a different aspect of it in terms of this idea of mysterious. But I think it's also important to understand the theme as dark. So even though we can see in this English translation is talking about mysterious, we want to keep in mind that it's using this same word again from chapter 1, where it's, this darkness within darkness. And so this valley spirit that never dies is called the dark female, or the mysterious female. The entrance, or in this case, it's actually the word for gate, the same thing that we saw in chapter 1, this gateway to understanding. It says the entrance, or the gate to the dark female, is called the root of heaven and earth. And to be delicate, again, looking at kind of natural ways of looking at things, there's definitely more of kind of an erotic way that this can be perceived. And I think this is very much intentional with how he's talking about the text. So just keep in mind, he's thinking of this in very much kind of natural terms. And it was, sexual activity was not something that was a taboo topic or off the table for the Taoists. It was definitely part of the way that they would talk about things. And so if you, as we're going through the text, come across different things and you think, is he saying what I think he's saying? Probably. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're looking at the Taoist writings. So then it continues, endless flow of inexhaustible energy. And this last part here can be translated in a couple of different ways, but it's trying to get at this idea that there's something about this dark female and this entrance, or this gate, that's the root between heaven and earth, that is inexhaustible, that it becomes the source of energy for life. We can think again about the valley, and this is the place that gathers everything together and produces, and all this life and activity happens, that it's kind of like this ongoing process that doesn't ever seem to get used up. And so here, the idea is, when we're thinking about moving into harmony with, or connecting with, the Tao, that it gives us this context that supports us, that it is something that we can draw upon as far as, kind of more sustainability in our life experience. And again, the role of the sage within the Daodejing is how do we move into harmony with or in cooperation with that way of experiencing life. So I did a fair amount of speaking here at the beginning about how this all plays out. I'm going to come back to our group share and see what kind of questions people have or thoughts about this chapter.
Well, Jim, just your comment, that story you brought up about the river, that Taoist story and going with the flow. I mean, that triggers a contemporary thought in my mind. Well, would a Taoist perspective be then embrace climate change, don't resist it?
Yeah, it's a very interesting thought because frequently Taoism is kind of associated with more kind of a quietism or a non-action. And I think that it's not calling for that at all. I think it's very much that we are going to do things. The question is, what kinds of things are we going to do? What are the goals that we're after? So whereas you might have goals that are trying to control things that are more a part of kind of what's happening in this dominant culture for the Tao Te Ching, and what they perceive as this overemphasis on the yang, the yin side is still actively doing things, but it's doing it different. So I think the approach to thinking about the environment from a Taoist perspective is, how do we understand how the environment works? How do all the pieces fit together? And how do we participate in that connection rather than interrupting it or trying to do something that's maybe more artificial or trying to control things that maybe shouldn't be controlled? And the consequences of that, something like, the dam breaking and the river coming and destroying the house, I would say, if we were going to translate that to the Taoist perspective, that would be more the kind of the expected result that is going to end up in something like climate change. And so the action of, moving the house to a different area, so we're not trying to dam the river so that we can let the river do what it needs to do, is taking action. It's not doing anything, but in doing so, it's trying to restore back to that normal balance within the environment so that it's not creating this destructive, or what we perceived as destructive behavior, because we were trying to build our house in the wrong place. And so I think that would be part of how it might approach this idea of like the climate crisis. But there's a whole nother aspect of this that's kind of interesting, in that, we tend to think about, and I even use the term myself, artificial, that there's things that are not natural that we do. But at a very fundamental level, there's nothing that could be done that's not actually natural. So humans doing things like building cars is something that is natural for us to do. It's not like unnatural. It's impossible to do something that's unnatural, right? By definition, natural is all the things that are possible within the natural world. Supernatural would be something that's outside of that or beyond that or incapable of that. So when we think about normal human activity, it's still normal activity. The question for the Taoists then is it in keeping with harmony the way that the rest of the creation functions? And our goal would be, how do we bring our actions in alignment with that, instead of trying to do the control mechanisms that end up kind of backfiring and creating bigger problems for us. Interestingly, you may have heard the term feng shui before, and that actually is a Taoist concept as well. And it has to do with two Chinese characters, which means wind and water. And it has to do with, where do you build your house in order to take advantage of, or thinking about the flows of water, and is that going to impact the house? And also the idea of the wind, and how's it going to structure or fit in as a structure in its environment. So it's taken on a very different kind of flavor in modern day thinking, but at its core, it had to do with, again, recognizing these patterns that's happening in nature. And when you're thinking about your activity in nature, taking those patterns into consideration so that you're not, building your house in a floodplain. Did that help, Rob, as far as that thought about climate change?
Yes, much appreciated. Yeah, very, very thoughtful response. Thank you.
Yeah. There's some other aspects too, I would say. In fact, there's a very interesting book. One of the Chinese translators that I like a lot is David Hinton, and he does a lot of translation of Chinese poetry as well as more of the classic philosophy stuff. But he just wrote a book recently. Let's see, do I have it handy? I don't have it in front of me here. I think it's called Wild Earth. I gotta look at the title. It's Wild something. It's like Wild Earth, Wild Human, or some kind of correlation there. And he's specifically addressing the issue of climate change, or what has been talked about as the sixth great extinction. And the reason they mention that is that we have 5 previous massive extinctions on the planet that we are aware of from the historic, well, not historic record, but the geographic record and geological record, I should say. And so he gets into the whole question, how do we look at that? How do we approach that as from his perspective, from this Taoist mindset? And there is an aspect of, what things do we have control over? What things do we not have control over? So there's kind of a letting go of things that we don't have anything that we can actually do anything about. But then there's also this kind of recognition that there's these cycles that even though humans may have, done irreparable harm potentially, and we still don't know, there's still a lot of questions about things. So I'm just speaking from, one particular frame of mind here, that it's not actually the end of nature. Nature's just doing what nature does. It's going to continue to do what it does. And if we think about this constant going back and forth between yin and yang, this balancing thing, but also, as we talked earlier about this idea of, this absence and presence and how things kind of become manifest and then go back into this idea of absence, but it's all kind of one thing, but it's just kind of showing up differently. That even though there may be what appears from a human perspective, these cataclysmic things happening on the planet, is still all part of that same process that's been going on long before we got here and will continue long after we're gone. And so they would see it as a little bit more of kind of like, yeah, this is kind of just the natural way of things. I mean, at some point, our sun is going to, expand to the point where it's going to encase the earth and, it's going to end all life on the planet. That's, probably several billion years away. But this idea that, life will come to an end on this planet at some point is inevitable. I mean, the whole universe is, as we understand it, because of entropy, is eventually going to wind down into basically this giant freeze. Everything's going to just be cold and black. So this cycle would definitely be something that they would take into consideration when they're approaching the current issues. And this isn't necessarily something that comes across as super encouraging from a certain perspective, because Taoists are a little bit not as much concerned about the human sphere of existence. I mean, they do care about it as being humans, but they are looking more above it, right? They're more concerned with the overall patterns and thinking about how does everything work, not just from a human perspective. They would maybe argue that part of the trouble we get ourselves into is when we're focused at more of that human, human-centric perspective, instead of recognizing ourselves as just one part of this whole. And so it can appear a little bit kind of like non-caring or kind of almost inhumane way of looking at things, but it has more to do with how do we recognize this ongoing cycle and pattern of everything, including this idea of life and death, that even if, climate change doesn't bring about some type of cataclysmic, extinction, we're all still going to have just our regular lifetimes and we're still going to die. So how do we understand that in the larger framework of things? And if they would argue that, kind of like we talked about last week, one of the images that comes up both with the Taoist and some of the Zen Buddhist thinking is this idea of the wave, that, it's all this ocean. So if we're thinking in Taoist terms, this idea of this absence is kind of the thing that makes everything, everything is this one thing. There's just one thing in the universe. The universe is one thing, but we see it manifest in different ways. And so with the ocean, you have this wave that appears. And if we're the wave, we look around and we think, oh, I'm a unique thing, and it is unique, and it's maybe feels like it's different from the rest of the ocean, but it's really just an aspect of the ocean that occurs as this wave for a period of time. And when the wave finishes, it's just going right back into this ocean. So it hasn't really ceased to exist. It wasn't actually even kind of like born in one sense, right? It was just kind of like this unique manifestation that exists for a period of time and then goes back. And we happen to be able to recognize this in terms of have this experience of it that goes beyond what would happen, let's say, with something like a tree that's, here for a period of time and then goes away. And we see how, it breaks down at that molecular and atomic level, and that everything is just made of these atoms that gets reused and repurposed. And even the atoms themselves are, probably something that is a product of a more fundamental thing yet, where there's these quantum fields that they talk about or something along those lines. So the idea that everything is one is really still part of kind of our modern best thinking from a quantum or particle physics perspective, but there's still this idea of this unique experience of what it is to be Jim Jones at this particular time and place that is cherished, but it's not permanent. It's constantly changing. I am not who I was when I was 5 years old. It's like my 5-year-old Jim is, in a sense, is dead, right? Current Jim, 55-year-old Jim, is very different than I was, and I'll continue to be different going forward. And it's a moment by moment changing, and it's not really going to be any different, when it comes time for me to die. It's a return back to whatever it was before I was even born, right? This would be kind of the way that you would talk about these kind of concepts within the Taoist perspective. And so it kind of, if there is a strong urge to control life, to protect it, to keep it from ending, which is kind of an inevitable thing, that would be seen as like the guy trying to dam the river to stop the river from doing what it was doing. So the recognition of that flow, of that natural way of things, would be a way that from the Taoist perspective, you would come to terms with something like our mortality that gives you a certain kind of peace about it, that also would be part of how we would approach something even larger, like the question about climate change. I know I kind of rambled a bit there, but what are your thoughts on that? Do you find the Taoist approach on that comforting or discouraging or depressing?
Not encouraging.
Yeah. I don't know.
Obviously, this isn't the only perspective out there, and I'm not suggesting that everyone should adopt this. I'm just trying to help understand the different frames of view. I, as a naturalist, kind of tend to fall much more in this kind of category myself, but I know that for myself, initially I don't know if there was an initially. It was such a gradual kind of transition for myself, how I kind of got to this point, but it definitely felt much more comfortable for me at a certain point where I was like, yeah, that just kind of makes sense about how things are, and how do I appreciate this momentary existence that I have, in the grand scheme of things. It's just a moment, right? But then that's part of what makes it special. The fact that it is brief, that it's ephemeral, is what gives it meaning and makes it uniquely, non-repeatable. And at the same time, I get to experience it, and so I appreciate that very much. And if it was something that never ended and just continued forever, it would be something that would be much harder to actually have any kind of meaning to, because everything would just kind of blend into a monotonous, ongoing foreverness, which is kind of an interesting problem in its own right, right? So you have the problem of meaninglessness if life is ongoing and never ending, but then you have definition that gives meaning and purpose in a sense, because life is brief, but at the same time you still have that concept of, it ending, that is that space for mourning and loss. So it's kind of an interesting conundrum we find ourselves in. But the more I think that we are aware of that mortality and we take it in, the more it allows us to really, in a sense, kind of maximize and appreciate the time that we do have, whatever that may be. And we've got a few minutes, or a little bit more than a few minutes still remaining. So where would you guys like to take this, or what kind of questions do you have?
I don't think I have any questions. I'm still thinking about like our relationship with nature and our tendency to seek control in our lives. Like many of us obviously have become comfortable with living in environments that are largely cut off from nature. I think it gives us like a false sense of control. Like we feel like we can control our environments, our lives a lot more easily in these spaces, but in reality, like we still can't control nature. And I think the desire for that control kind of gets in the way of us being in harmony with our surroundings. Like if we're always trying to control everything, we're going to miss out on opportunities to connect with nature and learn those patterns that are so valuable to our lives. And I think like just by letting go of some of that, and letting kind of the unknown take the wheel, we'll be able to bring that harmony back into our lives, and be able to just find a deeper sense of meaning and purpose from that. But yeah, just a thought, no questions.
Mm-hmm. No, that's good. I a book that I found very interesting a while back, Alan Watts, some of you may be familiar with him. He wrote a book called The Wisdom of Insecurity. And that it really kind of gets to this idea where we're constantly seeking this idea of security and kind of bedrock foundation that we can stand on, that doesn't move, doesn't change. And he's like, that's really kind of an illusion. And the more we chase after that, we kind of set ourselves up for potential problems. So, it's better to recognize that there is this insecurity, this uncertainty, and that the more we can embrace that, then the more, again, thinking about this idea of harmony with what is, better off we're going to be in terms of how we're experiencing life. And this might be another key topic to bring back, is that within Taoism, there's very much this concern about how do we remove those blinders or those filters through which we're looking at the world that are trying to get us to see more of these human-derived value judgments, about good or bad, beauty and ugly, that we talked about earlier, and instead try to understand just what is. And the more that we can do that, then the better we're going to be able to enter into that kind of more harmonious experience and relationship to our environment and to one another. What about the thoughts of this kind of this reassertion of the yin, more of this feminine attributes, or this way of looking at life as, or nature as this place of generative newness, as opposed to this scarcity model and this idea that we have to protect and separate and control? How does that kind of come across to you?
Well, I like in how the visual imagery, there is separation, right? And control in separating yin and yang when you look at the image of it. So you're saying one part of it is not control, and the other part is control, but the whole system is has like what would you say, a symmetry that's holding it together, that still designates the two things.
Yeah.
But I feel that's like a common feeling or motif, is like this idea of this chaotic world that's dark, and we don't know how things arise from it, but that's how the larger world of order is actually constructed.
Yeah, there's definitely a balance that they're saying it's not one or the other. And in that yin yang symbol, you see them kind of swirling. So there's this idea that things kind of transition into one. They don't stay just one thing, but it's this ongoing transformation. And then in each of the two sides that are kind of swirling, there's usually a little dot in the other one that is the opposite. So there's a little black dot within the white yang and the little white dot in the black yin. And it shows that there's kind of like a little bit of each in each, and they're transforming. But the question is, how do we have this balance? So there's a certain amount of order and predictableness that we need in order for life to exist. But then there's also this newness. So if things are too controlled and too focused on, this kind of order of things, then it becomes stale and brittle and not life affirming. But if it's too chaotic, if it's too new all the time, that also becomes problematic. So you need to have this balance between, newness and creativity, and this idea of order and structure in the right proportion to each other. Does anybody think? I'm sorry, go ahead, Dwayne.
I was just going to say, this reminds me of a lot of Buddhist readings I've studied, and I know like at some point these two meet, right? But these ideas of like control, of when, say, you're going through life and you're used to being in control of things, and then suddenly something happens that completely sets you off balance. And in Buddhist teachings, that's where exactly the point that you should stop trying to control things, that you should like open yourself and be tender to yourself about that moment that's happening, and not let yourself not go further into the control part of it, but instead let that moment kind of just overtake you for a time. So you don't shatter in a way or break it. It's kind of like fake like that. But that's kind of what this reminds me of, like how to deal with these moments where you're either fighting, you're swimming up the current, and yes, that strengthens you, but if you just keep doing it, you drown. Or you're going with the current, but if you just keep doing that, you could run into a boulder. So you have to like always have that balance.
Yeah,
or be aware of it.
I heard something really interesting recently. It's this philosophy of what you control controls you, because as soon as you stop controlling it, then it reverts to whatever it was before you started controlling it. So for instance, if you're this farmer that like created a dam, you constantly have to maintain that dam, assuming that you created the dam to like stop your house from flooding, blah, blah, blah. Then if the dam ever breaks, the whole thing that you were trying to stop from happening happens. And so you're constantly like charged with keeping that up. But like when I was traveling, one of the things that came up to me while I was just staring out on the fields was that when you control things, you're kind of externalizing their powers to you. So for instance, if you had cows, right? Let's say you have one cow. Well, if you control it by putting it in an acre of land, you constantly have to make sure that the grass is growing and that it has food to eat. And these things would have been things that the grass would be in charge of, and the cow would be in charge of finding the grass that it can eat, right? But now, because you've controlled it, you have to control even more things, which actually makes it unsustainable. If you think about trying to control the entire world, where it's like you should push the power as low as you can and let the grass decide where it wants to grow, and you can let the cow decide where it needs to eat. And in the end, you can just kind of harvest that when needed.
Yeah, there's a gardening technique called permaculture, which has that exact idea. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but yeah, it's that same idea of like, just let the thing do the thing. And you reap the reward from it. Like, if you exact too much control, you mess up the environment, or you run the risk of setting things way off balance.
Yeah. And there was another thought that that came up while I was driving, but my seatbelt chime was on and I didn't want to bother you guys. So we were talking about like how Jim was asking if we the fact that life just kind of lasted for a portion of time and then ended, if that was depressing. Well, my friend has the saying that he loves, and he always says it whenever people go through trouble or like they switch from happy to sad, or from like healthy to in pain. And he always says contrast brings clarity. And so the fact that there is an end to it allows us to learn the things that we need to learn right now. The fact that there is suffering allows us to learn the things that we need to right now. The fact that there are other people who are super rich and you're poor allows you to learn from that that contrast. And so it's really powerful once you start seeing the dichotomy you're stuck in whatever aspect of life it is. It's part of a gradient, and by learning one side, you can actually learn from the other side, just because they're connected.
Yeah. And you know, along those same lines, as David was saying, this idea that things don't stay one thing, they transition. And like that other Tao story we bring up frequently about the farmer whose horse runs away, you know, he's never certain about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, because it could change, and it does change, and it continues to keep changing, right? So there's kind of this idea of, you know, we'll see, you know, how is this going to turn out? And it allows, exactly like David was saying, you know, this ability to get clarity into things when we see, oh, you know, we thought it was this way and we were really comfortable with things this way, and it didn't work, and something's different or something changed, and now I have to readjust my perspective. I can see how much I had kind of gotten stuck in this one particular way of looking at things that was not really a permanent thing. Yeah, I really appreciate that.
I think there's kind of a Christian parallel too, Jim, to some of this, you know, in the Pauline notion of contentment, whatever one's circumstances.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of carryover in a lot of the different faith traditions, because a lot of the wisdom is, you know, ultimately kind of recognized in a lot of different places, because, you know, if the Taoists are right in the sense that they're just looking to these patterns that exist just in the natural world, then of course they're going to be recognized in lots of different places. Yeah. And to Dwayne's thought too about Taoist and Buddhist meeting, you know, the branch of Buddhism called Zen Buddhism is very specifically a Taoist interpretation of Buddhism. When Buddhism comes into China and is interpreted by Taoists, it becomes known as Chan, which is the Chinese word for meditation, and that gets exported to Japan, and Chan is translated as Zen, and that's where Zen Buddhism comes from. So there's a lot of connecting and talking back and forth with everybody.
Even East and West, interestingly enough, you know.
If you would like to participate in this Zoom conversation, you can sign up for the email address, or sign up for our email at www.kinship.cafe, and we'd love to have you be a part of this ongoing discussion. It's also our YouTube channel, which is Kinship Cafe, where you will see each of these videos, and our email will also send out links to those videos as they are published. So thanks so much, everybody, for joining us today.
Well, thanks, Jim.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks always.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll see you next week.
Bye.